أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Now, today we shall be continuing our lesson in disaster management and safety. In our last lesson, we introduced the cause, we defined what a disaster is, and we also talked about the classification of disasters. And we actually talked about the classification of disasters based on the speed. So some disasters, they start slow. Some disasters are rapid. We also talked about the origin of disasters. Some disasters are natural and some disasters are man-made. Now, in our lesson today, we shall move forward. And today we shall be discussing about the disaster management cycle. In our last lesson, we just talked briefly about this cycle. But in our lesson today, we shall be elaborating more about this cycle. So this lesson is very important because it is the core of the course. This course revolves around the disaster management cycle. Now, these are going to be our learning objectives today. By the end of this module, you should be able to, number one, define the disaster management cycle. Number two, explain the major phases of disaster management. Three, distinguish between prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and response. Then explain recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Then understand the relationship between disaster management and development. Then explain how disaster management can be integrated into the project life cycle. Then lastly, you should be able to identify practical disaster risk reduction measures. So in brief, this is what we are going to cover in our lesson today. Now, number one, as we start, is to define the disaster management cycle. So what is the disaster management cycle? The disaster management cycle is a continuous process through which governments, organizations, communities, and individuals plan for, respond to, recover from, and reduce the impacts of disasters. So the most important thing here in this definition is that the disaster management, it is a continuous process. So for example, you cannot say that you have planned and prepared and you're just going to sit. No. The planning and preparation is a continuous activity. Recovery is a continuous activity. Mitigation is a continuous activity. So it is a continuous process through which all the institutions, they respond to during disasters, they recover, and then lastly, they reduce the impact of disasters. Remember, in our last lesson, we clearly stated that the main objective of disaster management is not to avoid the disaster, but it is to minimize the what? To minimize or reduce the impact of disaster. Now, when you're talking about the major stages of disaster management cycle, they are, number one, we have the prevention and mitigation. Number two, we have the preparedness. Three, emergency response. Four, recovery and rehabilitation. Five, reconstruction and development. So these are the key words. These are the key disaster management cycle. Now, the key idea is disaster management is not only about responding after a disaster. It involves actions before, during, and after a disaster. So this is very important. So when you're talking about managing a disaster, the management starts even before the disaster. So this and this is basically the approach of being proactive. Proactiveness requires that we prepare for the disaster even before it happens. Now, another thing is disaster management. Of course, in our last lesson, we defined what disaster management is, but quickly, we shall just look again into this definition. So when you're talking about disaster management, it is the organized process of doing what? Planning, coordinating, implementing, and evaluating measures designed to prevent or reduce disaster risk, prepare for emergencies, respond effectively, and recover from disasters. So that is what disaster management entails. So, number one, it is all about planning. We need to plan. And planning basically involves all the activities that we normally do in the preparation stage, that is before the disaster. Coordinating normally happens at Tansik, normally happens fi athna, as the during the disaster. Then implementing normally happens also during the disaster, and evaluating normally happen after the disaster. So basically the disaster management process involves risk assessment, تحليل المخاطر, disaster prevention, تجنب الكوارث, mitigation. When you're talking about mitigation, as we shall discuss about it later, these are measures that help us to minimize the effects of disaster. Preparedness, التحذير, then responding, recovery, and reconstruction. Now, when you're talking about the disaster management cycle, what are we talking about? As we have just seen, the disaster management cycle is a continuous framework. Remember, I told you in the beginning, this cycle is continuous. It is a continuous framework showing how disaster-related activities move from risk reduction and preparedness to response, recovery, and reconstruction. It is often represented as a cycle, because the cycle demonstrates that recovery from one disaster should create lesson and improvements that reduce the impact of future disasters. So they're basically telling us it is a cycle, because after the disaster, we need to learn, we need to evaluate, we need to assess, and this information is going to help us when another disaster happens. So that is why it is a continuous process. Now, somebody can ask, why is the disaster management cycle important? Is it really important? Yes, the disaster management cycle is very important. Why? So number one, it reduces disaster losses. We saw in our first lecture. So the disaster management cycle enables us to reduce the losses. Number two, to protect human life, such that during disasters, people don't die. Protect property and infrastructure. Also to protect houses, to protect our roads, to protect our bridges. Then improve emergency preparedness. It also helps us to do what? To up our game when it comes to emergency preparation. Then coordinate disaster response, because when a disaster happens, Tansik, between the stakeholders, we have the government, we have the NGO, we have the community. So there needs to be effective coordination between all the stakeholders. So the disaster management cycle will help us on that. Then restore essential services. So the disaster management cycle help us to restore. Remember, we talked about the essential services: electricity, water, health services, food, water. These are the essential services that are needed when a disaster occurs. Then also build resilience. What is the meaning of resilience? Resilience basically means the ability to withstand the effects of a disaster. So resiliency basically happens when we are well prepared, When resiliency also happens when people are educated, we have enough capacity. Then lastly, reduce future risks. So effective disaster management should be continuous rather than reactive. And this is what we've been saying. Like, we should not wait for the disaster. We should not wait, but we should be proactive. Even before the disaster, we need to have a plan. We need to know what is going to happen. And if we do that, then we are going to minimize the loss of human life, the loss of property and infrastructure. But if we wait, and this is what happens in many countries in Africa, we normally wait until a disaster strikes, people die, property are destroyed, and that is when we are going to react, which is not actually a good approach. Now, what are the 5 main stages? Because we are talking of the disaster management as a cycle, al-halaka. So this halaka, it involves what? So the disaster management cycle can be understood through 5 major stages. So number 1 is prevention and mitigation. And we shall see later in detail what is the meaning of this. What is the meaning of prevention and mitigation? So these are actions that reduce disaster risk and potential impact. So the key word is to do what? Reduce. Remember, I told you, sometimes you cannot say that you have a plan that is 100% perfect. No. The disaster management cycle will enable us to minimize. Then number 2, preparedness. And this is where the planning comes in, التخطيط والتحذير. Actions taken before قبل حدوث الكارثة. Actions taken before a disaster to ensure what? Effective response. Number 3 is now the emergency response. This is after immediate action during and immediately after a disaster. Then recovery and rehabilitation. These are actions that restore lives, services, livelihoods, and systems. Then lastly, reconstruction and development. Long-term rebuilding and development that reduces future vulnerability. Now, these are the 5 major stages. Now, let us start, because we've talked about preparedness. So what is disaster? We've talked about prevention. What is disaster prevention? ماذا نعني? Because they normally tell us الوقاية خير من العلاج. So what is the meaning of disaster prevention? Disaster prevention refers to what? Actions intended to avoid. I need you to underline this word. To avoid, tajannub, to avoid the occurrence of hazards becoming disaster, or to prevent disaster impacts where possible. So when you're talking about prevention, these are actions that will help us to completely avoid the impacts of the disaster. Mathalan, avoiding construction in high-risk areas. So there are some areas that are high risk. Don't build your houses there, tajannub, because the area, when it rains, then the floods are going to be there. So what can you do? Don't build in those areas. If you don't build in those areas, you will not be affected by the disaster. So that is known as a tajannub. Number 2, enforcing building regulation. That comes from the Ministry of Planning. So for example, if anybody wants to build, then the local government has to come and check. The local government has to give the license. So the quality of the houses that we are building, they need to be checked. Then relocating highly exposed infrastructure, protecting natural barriers, and preventing activities that create unnecessary risk. So a good example is prohibiting construction in a non-floodplain can prevent future flood losses. For example, prohibiting, the government can say, Yajama, nobody is allowed to build 100 or 500 meters from the rivers, from the lakes. Nobody should be allowed. So if the government finds you building there, what is going to happen? You are going to be fined, you are going to be taken to a court of law. Now, so that is what is known as disaster prevention. At Tajannub, I told you the key word is to do what? To avoid. Now, let us go to the next thing. What is disaster mitigation? So disaster mitigation refers to measures taken to reduce. The key word here is to reduce, taklil. But when you were talking about prevention, it was to avoid. Tajannub tamaman. Walakin huna, when you're talking about mitigation, we are not avoiding, but we are coming with measures that will help us to reduce or minimize the severity, impact, or potential losses associated with hazards. So unlike prevention, mitigation does not necessarily eliminate the hazard. So mitigation does not eliminate the hazard. The hazard is there. ولكن نحن نريد بس تقليل الخسائر ليس تجنب الخسائر. And for example, building flood protection system. We can build flood protection system. But still, maybe maybe the flood system can be overrun by the water, but we are just building it to minimize. Strengthening buildings against earthquakes. We are going to strengthen our buildings, but still, the earthquake, with the effect of the earthquake will be there, but not that much. Constructing drainage system. We need to have drainage system. The drainage systems will help to minimize it. Installing fire-resistant material in our houses and buildings, planting vegetation to reduce what? To reduce soil erosion. Now, the key difference between prevention and mitigation is what? In an exam, you can be asked this question. So prevention is avoiding the risk where possible. تجنب المخاطر إذا أمكن تماما. أما الميtigation تقليل الأثر الكوارث, reducing the impact. Now you can see here clearly they are explaining to us the difference between what? The difference between prevention and mitigation. So prevention, avoiding the risk where possible. Mathalan, avoid building in high risk area. Don't build in high risk area. Protect natural barriers. Enforce building codes and zoning. Raise awareness. Educate the people. Let them know, the risk of. So the goal here is to stop or avoid the risk before it happens. This is very important. All these measures are taken before. Now, the opposite. When you are talking about mitigation, equals to reducing the impact when the hazard occurs. Mathalan, building stronger, safer structures, use protective infrastructure, prepare emergency plans and supplies. Then we have what? Early warning system. So the goal here is to reduce the impact and limit the damage. Look at the picture. So we are basically saying, build your house, the quality of the house, that build stronger houses. So in this picture, the rain is raining, but the house has been raised. So it is not going to be affected. And this is where the project management comes. You as project managers, when you are building your houses, you have to ensure that you are building the houses in such a way that when disasters strike, it's not going to affect your projects, you're not going to affect the houses. So that is why the disaster management knowledge is important to a project manager. So that is the difference between So prevention stops disasters from happening. Mitigation reduces the damage when they occur. Now, and when we are talking about, which is also very important, when we are talking about mitigation, then we are talking about the two types of mitigation. We have the structural and non-structural mitigation. Structural is for the project management. This is where the project managers comes in the structural. So the structural and non-structural. Here we don't need the project managers. So what is the difference between these two? So the difference between these two, structural measures, these are the physical construction or engineering solutions. So even before the disaster, we need to do what? We need to ensure that we build dams, and this is the work of the project managers. The drainage system is the work of the project managers. Flood barriers, strong building. You can be given a project of building a house, so it has to be strong. Retaining walls. So these are known as structural mitigation, physical. But non-structural measures, these are policies. The government needs to come with policies that will help minimize disasters. Knowledge, people have to be educated. Planning, the government needs to have the disaster management department that will help in planning. Regulation, the local government has to have regulations. And these regulations are going to guide the masses. So examples here, land use planning. The government can come with a policy. How do we use our land? Building codes. Before you build any house, there need to be some codes. You all know as project managers. Public education, insurance, early warning system. So the key word here is effective disaster risk reduction usually combines both approaches. So if we want to do what? If we want to reduce the risk of disasters, we need to combine the structural, build good roads, build good houses, and the non-structural. People should be educated. We should have some policies. So now this is the difference between the two. The difference between, so the structural, look at the structural. This is the work of the project managers. So if we don't want disasters, if we want to minimize the effects of disasters, we need to have dams. We need to build good dams. We need to build a good drainage system. We need to have flood barriers. These flood barriers, these are, for example, when it rains a lot and the amount of water is that much. So these barriers, they act as walls. Then strong buildings. Our buildings should not be weak. So even if there is an earthquake, at least the building can do what? Can stand. Yes, there will be some minor losses. Then retaining walls. So these walls are these walls, they almost play the same roles as the flood barriers. Sometimes when it rains a lot, the retaining walls, they prevent actually water. Now, when it comes to the non-structural are policies, knowledge, planning, and regulation. We need to educate people about what are the disaster, how they should prepare during disaster. Building codes, we need to have the local government, before approving the construction of any house, they have to ensure that they have the building codes. The land use planning in every country, that is what is known as the urban planning. So there are some areas located for the industries, areas located for the school, areas located for the markets. So that is what is known as land use planning. You can also ensure early warning, ila ghairi dhalik. So that is the difference between the structural and the non-structural measures. So they are telling us, if you want to minimize the effects of disasters, you need to combine these two, both the structural and the non-structural. Now, what is the importance of what? What is the importance of prevention and mitigation? So prevention and mitigation are important because they reduce death and injury. If we prepare well, then we are going to save lives. Economic losses. We are also going to minimize the economic losses. So business will continue even after disasters. Business are not going to be affected. Infrastructure damage, we are going to reduce the damages on our drainage system, our roads, our bridges. Disruption of essential services. So during disaster, the supply of water will still be there, the supply of electricity, the supply of medicine, the supply of food. Then it will also reduce the displacement of communities, because sometimes when disasters happen, communities are displaced. But if we prepare well, it is going to reduce the displacement of people. Then the recovery cost is not going to be much. Why? Because we have reduced the losses of infrastructure, the economic losses has been minimized. So the recovery cost will not require a lot of resources during the recovery stage. So the core idea is investing in risk reduction before a disaster is generally more effective than relying entirely on emergency assistance afterward. So this is the concept of al-waqaya khairun min al-ilaj. That is investing in risk reduction before. So we have to invest, the government has to invest a lot in building good roads. It has to invest a lot in ensuring that it has good drainage system. Now, on to the next part of our lesson. What is disaster preparedness? So we are through with disaster prevention and mitigation. Now we are going to the next cycle, which is preparation, at-tahdhir wa at-takhtit. So what is disaster preparedness? Disaster preparedness refers to the knowledge, ma'rifah. We are talking about the capacities. Here we are talking about al-maharat, plans, systems, and resources developed before a disaster to enable an effective response. So هنا نحن نخطط. We are planning so that we need to win. Like just a football team, they need to plan how they are going to play so that they win. So if we want to win against the disasters, we need to have a very good plan. So preparedness answers the question, what will we do if a disaster happens? ماذا سنفعل إذا وقع الماذا عند الحدوث الكارثة؟ ماذا سنفعل؟ ما هي الأنشطة التي سنشتغل فيها؟ So preparedness includes emergency plans. What are the emergency plans? Which route are we going to use if there is an emergency? The movement of people. Training. At-tadrib, we need to train people, so that when a disaster happens, at least we have a good number of people who can help. Drills. Drills is, when we're talking about a drill is like we are acting. We are assuming, yeah, Jama, there is a fire. So if there is a fire, you act like a drama. What is going to happen in case there is a fire? So it is just like an example. You are acting. Then we have emergency supplies. The medicine, should be there. Communication system, how are we going to communicate during disasters? Then evacuation plan. How are we going to evacuate people in case there is an earthquake, in case there is a flood, in case there is a volcano, in case we have heavy winds, strong winds? How are you going to evacuate people? We need to have an evacuation plan. Then early warning system. Early warning system is all about, we need to have what? We need to have alarms, such that when there is a disaster, there is an alarm. People react quickly to minimize the what? To minimize the losses. Now, what are the components of preparedness? This is what you are just seeing now. So emergency planning, This means developing clear procedures, al-ijra'at wadih, procedures for responding to different hazards. Different hazard. If there is fire, hada masanafal. This is the plan for fire. If there is flood, this is the plan for flood. If we are going to have an earthquake, this is the plan. Number 2, training. This is all about the teaching staff. We need to have teachers who are going to train to train people. Emergency personnel, the doctors, the nurses, they also need to be trained how to behave, how to react during disaster. And communities, the community also, we need to educate the people in the community so that they know what to do during disasters. Simulation exercises, practicing emergency procedures through drills. So this is where you assume that there is a fire. So what are you going to do? These are known as simulations. They are not real. We are acting. Then emergency resources, we need to ensure that we have enough food, water, medicine, equipment, and communication tools. Then early warning, providing timely information about approaching hazard. And this is very important. And many disasters, sometimes normally after disaster, many disasters normally causes a lot of losses. Why? Because people are not given the information. And that is the responsibility of the government. For example, if it is raining and the rains are going to be heavy, the meteorological department has to give an alert to people through the media. Ya Jama, you need to move from the rivers, from those people who are living near rivers, near the lakes. Ya Jama, leave those areas because next week we are expecting a lot of rain. So the information, empowering people with information, the awareness is of the essence. Now, the early warning system, what do we mean by early warning system? When we are talking about an early warning system is what? It's an organized system that detects potential hazards and communicates warning so that people can take protective action. So, and with the AI technology, many countries have integrated AI into their systems. So the AI can help to detect fire, can help to detect, for example, rainfalls, heavy rainfalls, can help to detect earthquakes even before they occur. So people can take the necessary action. So an effective warning system requires risk knowledge. The system needs, and this is where the AI helps. Hazard monitoring, the system should be able to monitor the different types of hazard. Warning, the system should be able to generate warning and response capability. So for example, if a flood warning system detects rising water levels, authority can warn communities and organize evacuation before the flood reaches populated areas. So this is an example like I was just explaining a few minutes ago. So we can have floods warnings, a system that can help us to detect the levels of water. So if the levels of water are rising quickly, there will be an alarm and the authorities can warn people to take the necessary actions. Now, emergency preparedness plans. A good emergency plan should identify possible hazards. ما هي المخاطر متوقعة. Number 2, people at risk. ما هي أناس. Who are the people who might be affected? Who are the vulnerable people during a disaster? Emergency responsibility. ما هي المسؤوليات? Who is going to do what during the disaster? Then communication procedures. Okay, إجراءات التواصل. How are we going to communicate when there is a disaster? Number 5, evacuation routes. Which routes are we going to use when you are evacuating people? For example, there is a fire. That is why in any house, you need to have an emergency door. You know, so the emergency door is for the evacuation. Even in an airplane, you normally have the evacuation doors. Now, emergency shelters. If if for example the disaster destroys people's shelter, we should have option B, where they're going to live. Available resources. We need to have available resources, the water, the medicine, ila ghairi dhalik. Emergency contacts. We need to have the numbers of the police, the number of the fire department. We need to have the number. We need to have contacts in a book such that when a disaster strikes, we can easily and quickly communicate. Then coordination mechanism, كيف سيتم التنسيق among all the stakeholders. So a plan should be tested and updated regularly. We need to test our plan and we need to update it regularly. So a plan that exists only on paper but has never been practiced may fail during a real emergency. So a plan that is just written is not a good plan. We need to write the plan, and we need to train. We need to have the drills. We need to have the simulations. Now, on to the next part. What is emergency response? This is another important area of disaster management cycle. So what is emergency response? Emergency response refers to immediate action taken during and immediately after a disaster. Again, immediate actions taken during and immediately after a disaster. فهذه الأنشطة هذه العمليات, these are the actions that we take immediately when the fire strikes, immediately when the flood strike, immediately the earthquake strike. How are we going to respond? So to save the lives, because we are responding to save the lives, to reduce suffering, to protect property, and meet basic needs. So the primary priorities during any response, number one, we are responding to save lives. We don't want people to die. Number two, we are responding to reduce injuries and suffering. We are responding to provide essential assistance like water, food, medicine. We are responding to do what? To protect critical infrastructure. We are responding to restore essential services like electricity. So response activities are usually conducted under difficult and rapidly changing conditions. So during response, sometimes the situation is very difficult. And things, for example, if there is fire, responding when there is fire is very difficult, you know? And things are changing rapidly during the disaster. So we have 1 minute remaining. So after this, I will send another link. We still have a few slides remaining. So I will send another link after this, and we will continue from there after the short break. But before the break, we can just continue before the links goes off. So that is what is meant by emergency response. Now, what are the major emergency response activities? And this is very important. Like when we are responding, what should we focus on? What are the key activities? Number one, search and rescue. We are searching. If there is an earthquake, we are searching for people who are down there, people who are under the debris. We are searching